Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description.
Son of a Devil, Luffy, by Youngsoul. Instead of growing up in the peaceful Fuchsia, Luffy gets taken away by the Marines when his grandfather is unable to protect his true identity, making his road to becoming the greatest pirate a bit rougher. Big shout out to the warlords of this channel: Craig Twitchell, Throat Punch, Rodarius Jones, Mative Warrior, Claude Lefrace, Neo Wesker 23, Derek Dowdy, Zazu Syaz, Abdul Rauf Ali, N3WT, what_if_lord, Black Money _Young Leon, Garrick Russell, Case Clark, KSGPL4YZ, and Brian McKenzie. You know who you are. Want to stand among legends? Join the channel membership and show your support. Adios.
Chapter 1. The son of a devil. The sun had almost completely disappeared into the horizon far ahead, behind the desert that seemed to stretch on forever, as two men stood on the edge of a hill, staring at the final rays of light. They were both quiet at first, letting the situation truly sink in. Garp, the other man, started, clearly much younger than his companion who stood behind him. This will be the last time we meet. I have become an existence that the world government will no longer be able to ignore, and so I must move to a safe location. The older man shifted his weight and unconsciously crossed his arms. What makes you think I won't just capture you right now? The younger man smiled. I'm sure you would have done it by now. The Marine sighed deeply and closed his eyes for a moment. You must realize that this is the last time I will be lenient on you, he said before eyeing the figure in front of him. I can't help you after this, even if you are my son. There was a pregnant pause before the younger said, there is one thing I would want your help with. The older went rigid with anger instantly. I just told you, I can't help you any. It's not for me, the other interrupted and finally turned around to meet his father's eyes. It's for my child. The Marine's mouth dropped open and his eyes went wide at the news. Why your child? When did you? My child hasn't been born yet, but I can't take care of them now that I have become so infamous. My lifestyle is going to be filled with war and death. It's not a place to grow a child. Garp frowned, not liking where this was going. Garp, a newborn child bears no sins. Just because I am a criminal doesn't mean my child carries that same fate. I am asking this as your son. Please take care of my child. The Marine gritted his teeth and closed his fists. You outlaws are all selfish, leaving your children without their fathers to grow up with. The man muttered before meeting his son's confident smile. Girl or a boy, make sure that child grows up strong and free, the man said before lifting up the hood of his cloak and turning around to leave. Wait, I haven't even given my consent yet, the older man shouted, earning a laugh from his son. I'm sure you'll define. It's not your first time raising a child after all. The man laughed while waving his hand as a sign of goodbye. You'll find them in Fuchsia. Garp knew he could still stop his son and tell him to throw the responsibility on someone else. However, just like 3 years ago, he was unable to. He knew that if he refused, his son's child would eventually be found and executed along with their mother. For the love he still had towards his son and for the sake of saving an innocent child, Garp stayed silent. Ah! The departing man suddenly shouted and stopped before glancing at his father over his shoulder. I almost forgot, my child's name will be Luffy. That's what he will be called, Garp said as he was holding the crying infant for the first time. Luffy was crying, loud and clear, as he had just moments ago taken his first breaths. The young girl, who had assisted with the delivery, had already cleaned the baby and wrapped him up in a blanket before giving him to the Marine. The man stared down at the child for a moment before looking at the dark-haired woman on the bed sadly. I'm sorry that I couldn't help you. I will keep him safe, not only for Dragon but also for you. The woman still wore a small smile on her face, even though her lips were turning blue as her body went cold. The young girl, Makino, Garp remembered, tried to wipe her tears away as she walked over to the woman's body before pulling a big sheet over her. She paused before covering the woman's face, looking at her still healthy colored cheeks for the last time. Swallowing down a sob, Makino finished her task and put her palms down on the edge of the bed. Garp watched her in silence as she shook, trying to hold her tears back. "She was a good woman," the girl then stated with a shaky voice. The only sound in the room were the cries of the newborn child. Garp didn't feel like comforting the baby as the sounds he made almost seemed to be due to losing his mother. The old marine closed his eyes for a second before opening them again and looking at the bed. Yes, she really was. Finally, the young girl let herself go and started to cry along with the infant. Garp only stood and listened to the two, like it was his duty to do so. He hadn't known Luffy's mother for long, only those few weeks he had been together with her during her last stages of pregnancy. But to say she was a good woman was definitely not a lie. It was truly a sad thing that she was not strong enough to survive the childbirth, especially since Luffy's life was bound to be difficult due to his father's identity. Now, he would have to survive without a mother as well. Why Garp had to witness the same tragedy again was a complete mystery to him. He thought that after seeing a young mother die 3 years ago he would never have to see the same thing happen again. Yet here he was, holding a motherless baby who was unlikely to see his father in a very long time, if ever. Garp once again looked at the child in his arms, who had quieted down and was now staring up at his grandfather curiously. "Don't worry, kid. I won't let you become a criminal and join this cycle," Garp promised the baby with a faint smile. The baby didn't respond in any way, unable to understand a word he was being told. Then, he let out a yawn and let his big baby eyes close, falling asleep in the strange new world he had arrived in. Garp had made sure that no one had followed him to Fuchsia when he had sneaked off their ship, which was docked in Goa Town, intending to keep the location a complete secret from the other Marines. He planned on leaving Luffy in the village until he was old enough to start his training, since it would be impossible for the old Marine to grow the boy right under the noses of the people who would have him killed if they knew who he was. The old Marine felt confident about his plan. Luffy would stay safe in the small village, away from anyone who might be able to know his true identity. He was heading to the village mayor, wanting to know if there was someone who could raise Luffy now that he had lost his mother, when he heard the bundle in his arms give a happy squeal. The sound caused the man to stop and stare at the boy. Somehow it only now sank into his head that this was his one and only grandson, and so he couldn't resist the urge to gently hold the baby's tiny fist with his big fingers. "You're a cute one, aren't you?" he cooed and felt Luffy grab his index finger inside his small fist while giving squeals of joy. "Monkey D. Luffy. That's your name, little one. It's a good name. Don't worry, I'll make sure that your name won't be known all over the world like your father's. Dragon might be a criminal, but I'll make sure that you'll become a righteous man. Like your grandfather." He laughed and continued his way towards the village mayor. The village mayor was devastated about the news of Luffy's mother's death, but quickly gathered himself enough to think of someone to take care of the infant for now. They talked about a possible woman for a while before Garp asked the mayor to guide him to her house. The two had just walked outside when Garp noticed the Marines. They stood in 3 straight rows, their commander standing in front of them, clearly waiting for the vice admiral to arrive. Once Garp had walked over to them, the commander saluted and the others behind him followed suit. The old Marine unconsciously pulled the infant in his arms a bit closer to himself as he felt like something bad was about to happen. He saw the way sweat rolled down the commander's forehead and how his entire figure was tense with nervousness. "Vice Admiral Garp," he addressed his superior. "I have received information claiming that the baby you are holding is the son of the revolutionary Lunder. The orders of Fleet Admiral Sengoku to confirm this information and bring the child with us if it would prove to be correct," the young Marine explained, his hand shaking due to the fear of what Garp might do to him for threatening his grandson. Garp stood silently in front of his subordinates, gritting his teeth. The idiots had followed him all the way to Fuchsia and heard him talking about Luffy. He knew that if he didn't make up a lie, Luffy would be taken away and killed. Running away and finding Luffy a new place to hide was no longer an option. The rumor would already have spread and his movements were going to be monitored closely. Luffy wouldn't stand a chance. Lie, Garp told himself. Lie, and Luffy can still stay alive even if it meant that he would carry another name. Lie, and you can save him. Lie, and you can grant him a normal life. Even though Garp told himself those things over and over again, he was unable to open his mouth. He couldn't do it. Even if this was a matter of family, Garp couldn't betray the Marines. He couldn't look into the eyes of his subordinates and tell them a lie, even if it was to save his grandson's life. Being a Marine had long since ceased to be a job and was now a second family to him. He was a Marine, through and through, and to ask him to ignore it was impossible. He would think of something. Luffy might get captured, but he might have still had a chance of staying alive. If he could be raised to be a Marine. If he became one of them, he might escape the fate of being used as a negotiation piece or being killed. It was definitely not the freedom Dragon wished for his child, but right now the options were scarce. Garp closed his eyes before taking a deep breath and letting it out. "Yes, you heard right," he told silently. The other Marines were shocked at the news, but Garp didn't let them talk over him. "But he is also my grandson and so I have the right to raise him. Tell Sengoku that I will be meeting him once I return to the headquarters to discuss this further." Garp's hopes of buying a little time quickly became crushed. "I'm sorry, Vice Admiral, but we are under direct orders of the Fleet Admiral. The child of Revolutionary Dragon must be captured and brought to the headquarters immediately." "Captured?" Garp shouted, enraged. His loud voice caused the sleeping infant in his arms to wake and start wailing loudly. Garp was too angry to even notice this as he looked at his men, who had jumped back in fear at the sudden change of their superior's attitude. "Are you unable to see that I'm carrying a newborn child? He is completely unable to protect himself in any way and you want to capture him? Are you going to put cuffs on him and throw him into a cell?" The Marine shouted at his frightened men. "I will bring him to the headquarters myself, but until then I demand you to treat him like the baby he is. You should have enough brains to tell that this child is no criminal. No matter what anyone says," the Marine finished, finally having calmed himself down. None of his men had anything to say to this and they all looked somewhat guilty for even using the word capture. Garp sighed heavily and started rocking the baby in his arms in order to calm him down. There. It's all right," he assured the baby as he turned around to see the village mayor again. "It seems like there has been a change of plans," he told the old man sadly, unable to hide his true feelings. "I will be taking Luffy with me." The mayor seemed to be bewildered about everything that had just happened and so it took him a moment to collect himself enough to answer. "I see. Are you able to keep him safe?" He almost whispered the last part so only Garp could hear. The Marine considered the words for a moment before shaking his head softly. "I don't know, but I will try my best." Garp, the Fleet Admiral Sengoku began once the said man had sat himself in a chair in his office. "I was going to have you dismissed when I found out you had plotted against the world government by harboring Roger's son 2 years ago," the man told calmly as he stared out of the big window before turning and facing the other man. "And now you have gone and done it again. Tell me one good reason I wouldn't have you arrested right now due to conspiracy," the man shouted, clearly in rage. Garp lifted his head and stared at his superior for a while. Then, he laughed loudly and waved his hand. Now, let's not take this so seriously. Let's drink some tea and have some crackers," the man said and lifted up a bag of crackers he had brought with him. "You're the one not taking this seriously enough," Sengoku shouted. He could almost feel himself aging when Garp laughed back at him. "Listen here, Sengoku. Those 2 children are my family now. Their fathers are what they are, but I don't see any reason why they would turn out to be the same," he told his old friend with a grin. "You know that the world government doesn't see it that way. If their fathers are not able to be brought to justice, their sins carry on to their sons." Garp's smile fell a little at those words. "I won't be able to ignore your actions this time." Garp knew that he wasn't able to get away with what he had done this time. Even if it was a matter of family, Sengoku wasn't going to overlook it. Still, it didn't mean Garp wouldn't try. "Come on, Sengoku," the man whined. "He's just a baby. I could grow him to be a strong Marine. I'm sure you know how strong the D bloodline is. He would be more than you ever hoped for. Just let me take him back to Fuchsia, where he can grow for a few more years before." "No," the Vice Admiral interrupted. "That child will stay in the headquarters. We will send a word to the world that Dragon's son has been captured and if the man wishes to see him again, he would do well to surrender himself." The last of Garp's smile fell and a frown replaced it. "You know he won't accept that, even if you were threatening him with his son's life." Sengoku met his cold eyes with Garp's much warmer ones, staring at the man in complete silence for a moment before answering. So be it. After those words, Sengoku strode back to his desk and sat down, pulling papers from a drawer in front of him. I'm having you suspended for the time being, he stated and started to fill in the form. It wasn't like Garp hadn't expected this, but it still felt wrong. Please wait, let's talk about this. I'm done talking, Sengoku shouted and punched his fist down to silence the other. I have placed much trust on you during all these years, but it seems like I was wrong to do so. You betrayed me and everyone else. This time you won't get away with it. The old marine gritted his teeth and got up from his seat. The two met eyes briefly before the older turned away to leave the room. One more thing, Sengoku stopped the other before he could reach the door. You won't be seeing your grandson during your suspension, that's all. Garp turned around and stared at his old friend in shock. He wanted to shout at him, tell him that he couldn't do it, but was able to calm his boiling blood before he lashed out. He knew it wouldn't do him any good if he would fight against Sengoku now. He had already got suspended. If he tried anything else he might as well throw his white coat away right then and there. That's why Garp gritted his teeth, swallowed down his anger and feeling of betrayal, and exited the room quietly. Sengoku looked at the door after the other had left and gave a sigh. What am I going to do with you? The seagulls cried loudly and flew about a certain harbor as a big marine ship was preparing to raise its anchors and leave the safety of the marine base G-14. The sun was shining, though it was unclear how long the fine weather would last with the ever-changing weather the Grand Line offered. Still, the members of the crew seemed to be in high spirits, knowing that instead of a mission, they were just going to have a safe transporting task. The docks were bustling with life, supplies getting carried inside the ship while some prepared the ship. The only time the working men stopped was when the ship's captain, Vice Admiral Garp, appeared, though the man himself wasn't the reason for halting their work. It was because of the small figure that walked beside the big man, holding the old man's hand while looking down at his feet, that the men stopped. All of them had heard rumors about the boy's existence, but it was the first time any of them saw him. The men started to whisper among themselves and kept staring at the boy as if he was some kind of strange animal as the two walked towards the ship. The boy kept looking down, his small shoulders looking like they were carrying the weight of the entire world. He tightened his grip on the much stronger hand guiding him and kept walking. The old marine next to him kept looking around the dock, completely ignoring the strange looks the boy was getting. It's a fine day to head to the sea, the man told, clearly feeling happy. The boy didn't answer the marine, but was encouraged enough to take a quick peek at the ship they were heading towards. It was not before the two had boarded the ship that the rest of the marines had stopped staring and returned to their tasks. But even with the lack of eyes staring into his back, the small boy could not relax. Taking a note of this, the elderly marine let go of the boy's hand. Come, Luffy. I'll show you something, the man simply told before he started to head towards the bow of the ship. The child wasted no time in following him, clearly not comfortable enough to stay there alone. Gramps. The two of them walked all the way to the figurehead before the boy's grandfather finally stopped. He stared at the horizon ahead that seemed to go on forever. He glanced down at his grandson to see him switching his gaze from him to the ocean. Luffy's tired and emotionless expression changed immediately after he saw the scene. His mouth fell open and his eyes widened slowly, as if not daring to believe what he was seeing, before he took in a big breath as a big, excited grin appeared on his small face. Wow, he breathed, as if he was too afraid to make too much noise. He raised himself on tiptoes to look at the blue waters, but didn't take a single step to move closer to the railing where he could have seen better. Grinning at the child's actions, Garp lifted him up by the scruff of his shirt before walking to the railing, where Luffy had clearly wanted to go, before setting him down to sit on the edge. He kept a cautious hand next to the child's frame just in case he would get too excited and fall over. And boy, was that a good precaution to take. Right after Luffy could really see everything, he took in another excited breath as his eyes seemed to almost sparkle as he threw his hands up and shouted, "Wow! What is this? It's so big!" The sudden movement caused the little boy to lose his balance, and if it wasn't for his grandfather's big hand that supported him, Luffy would have been making one grand splash below right about then. Garp was too pleased to see Luffy's reaction to even bother scolding him for being so careless. Instead, he smiled and kept his hand against the child's back. "That's the sea, Luffy." "The sea? It's huge?" the boy exclaimed, never turning around. Does it go on forever? Garp grinned at the boy's questions. Some say it doesn't. However, I have never sailed all the seas so I wouldn't know, he admitted with a laugh. Luffy turned around to look at his grandfather. Someone has sailed all the seas? He asked in awe. Garp met his eyes with the much younger and curious ones. That's what they have claimed, he told and gave another laugh. Luffy stared at the old marine for a long while, clearly thinking deeply about something. Then, he closed his mouth that was slightly open and turned his gaze back towards the horizon. Garp couldn't help when his smile kept getting bigger. It had been a very long time since he had seen the boy so excited and happy. Since he had seen him be a child like he was. It was too often that the boy was emotionless or sad instead of the child Garp knew his grandson was truly. Luffy stayed silent as his eyes were fixed ahead, expression slowly melting back into the somber one. Still, Garp could recognize the longing in his eyes. A seagull flew past the ship, crying out loudly as it seemed to enjoy its freedom. Luffy watched as it flew into his range of view, his mouth once again opening slightly. I wish I could fly away like that, he then whispered. His tone was so heavy and filled with hopelessness that Garp felt his heart break. No 5-year-old child should ever have to say things like that. But Luffy was trapped, his freedom ripped away from him before he even had the chance to experience it. Garp knew it all, but he couldn't do anything about it. So he gritted his teeth. All his earlier good mood wiped away once again as the realization hit him hard once more. Luffy would never be free. 2 days passed and Luffy enjoyed his days at the ship fully. He loved how he was allowed to run around the ship and no one would get angry at him no matter what he did or broke when he got clumsy. And he got to eat with his grandpa every day. Not only was the food yummy, but his grandpa also seemed to be in a good mood. It made Luffy happy as well. He still needed to see the mean nurses every morning and evening so they would inject him with something and feed him medication. Luffy didn't like it, but at least he didn't have to go through anything painful. Still, no matter what kind of bad things Luffy would have to go through, he knew that what he got to see every single day made it all better. The sea around them was so big and amazing that he almost couldn't believe it. Not only was it big and tasted salty, he had secretly stretched his hand to scoop up some water for a test taste. But there were also so many things that lived in it. He had seen big school of small fish right next to the ship and then some really big fish. There had been one really big fish too, one day. It was very long, at least twice the ship's length, Luffy estimated. And it was brightly colored. His grandpa had called it a sea king, but Luffy didn't really understand it well. There are kings in the sea? He had asked his grandpa. Yes, the sea kings are so big and powerful that they rule underneath the sea, his grandpa had explained. But, I thought that the sea didn't belong to anyone, Luffy had asked, his voice telling about how disappointed he was feeling. His grandpa grinned, you're right, it doesn't, but that's why it belongs to everyone and everything. Honestly, Luffy had just become more confused about his grandpa's explanation. How could something belong to no one and belong to everyone at the same time? It made no sense. Maybe it really was like those old marines sometimes said. His grandpa was a bit strange in the head. Confident with his thought process, Luffy once again made his way to the bow of the ship like he did every day. He didn't know many people on the ship, so he didn't feel like greeting any of them as he walked across the deck. None of them gave Luffy any attention, so he didn't give them any. He walked up the stairs and to the railing. He would have desperately wanted to sit on it, but after almost falling in the day before, he was strictly banned from climbing anywhere where he could fall off the ship. Luffy pushed his lips in annoyance as he had to just settle with peeking over the tall railing with a little help of his rubber powers. He felt an annoying pain run through his stretching parts. The pain kept growing stronger the longer Luffy kept stretching his body, but he didn't want to leave his spot yet. He could handle this much. After all, he got to look at the sea again. Suddenly, something appeared in the horizon that hadn't been there before. Luffy was surprised to see anything disturb his perfectly clear view, and so he tried to squint his eyes to see what the small spot was. Just as he was about to give up and go ask his grandpa, he heard a shout from the crow's nest. An unknown vessel, 12 o'clock. Luffy was surprised when at least 10 marines ran right next to him to look at the small spot too. One of them had a long metal pole, which Luffy had yet not learned to be called a telescope, that he peeked into. It has a black flag. It's pirates. The The man with the pole suddenly shouted so loudly that Luffy got startled and fell on his butt. He knew that the men needed to shout information loudly so everyone could hear, but still, they were so loud. Heavy footsteps approached them and Luffy turned to see his grandpa. He had his usual grin on his face and his figure was powerful. Feeling a childish surge, Luffy got up and ran to his only family before clutching onto his leg tightly. Garp rested a comforting hand on his head, his gaze never tearing from the object far away on the sea. "What should we do, Vice Admiral Garp?" one of the soldiers asked. Garp seemed to think about it for a while before looking down to his grandson who had hidden his face into the white fabric of his pants. "Luffy," he began, making the child look up to his face. "You remember what I told you about pirates, don't you?" Luffy looked surprised at the question, but nodded. "They're bad people," he answered simply and with certainty. "Yes, they're bad people. And you remember what I told you about my job?" Garp asked, earning another nod from the child. "You told me you catch bad people." "That's right. Now, Luffy," he said and moved the boy so he could get on one knee. "Tell me, are you afraid of pirates?" Luffy pushed his lips and thought about an answer. "I don't know. I guess you told me they are bad people. Are they scary too?" he asked innocently. "They can be very scary, but that's why I have to catch them so they won't scare anyone anymore." Luffy looked at his grandpa before looking at the pirate ship again. "You're going to catch them too?" Just as Garp was about to answer, a soldier informed, "It's the Red Hair Pirates." The name meant nothing to Luffy, but it made his grandpa grin even wider than before. "That kid, EY?" he said to no one in particular before he looked back to his grandson. "Yes, Luffy. We're going to catch those pirates. It might be a bit scary for a while, but you can handle it, right?" Luffy seemed to be happy with his grandfather's answer and so he nodded. "Yeah, catch those bad pirates, Gramps." Garp laughed before he got up again. "Men, prepare for battle," he ordered. The Marines began to run around, everyone going to do their jobs as Garp stood at the bow with confidence. Luffy felt his tiny heart beat both in fear and excitement. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it involved guns and cannons. He wondered if his grandpa would let him try to shoot a pistol too, but quickly dismissed the thought as he knew he would just get a hard hit on his head for asking something like that. Still, it was really exciting. He got to see a real battle. At least that's what he thought until the next moment. "You!" Garp suddenly shouted to a nearby Marine. "Take Luffy below deck and make sure he stays there, it's too dangerous for him up here." "No, Gramps," Luffy shouted in defiance. He really wanted to see, however, his grandpa was having none of it. "You will be safer there, Luffy. You might get hurt here or worse. Just listen to my order this once." Luffy was lifted from the ground before he could say another word. He gritted his teeth in anger as he watched his grandpa disappear from his view as the Marine holding him was starting to descend the stairs. "Idiot Gramps!" he shouted once more in anger before he could no longer see the old man. If only he had known that he wasn't going to see his grandpa in a very long time after that, he might have chosen his words differently. Luffy could feel how the ship rocked when the battle went on. The cannons not only made a huge noise but also made the floor and walls tremor in a strange way. Luffy decided that he had been wrong about the pirates. He was definitely scared of them. He had heard their shouts when they had got onto their ship and it had scared Luffy so much that he had taken his blanket and crept underneath his bed to hide. It made him feel the tremors of the cannons more, but he felt slightly safer there. Hidden, small, unnoticeable. Suddenly, there was a violent jolt and a sound bigger than any cannon. The whole room shifted into a strange angle and Luffy found himself sliding away from under the bed to the middle of the floor before the room went back to normal. What was that?" he shouted to himself and stood up even though his knees shook violently. He clutched his blanket tightly, trying to gain comfort from it, as he slowly crept closer to the door. He could hear men shouting loudly, some in pain, and he found himself holding his blanket tighter. The ship then once again rocked violently and Luffy was thrown back on his bottom. Before he had time to even wonder what had happened, he felt something wet under him. He looked down to see water everywhere and raised his gaze up slightly to see how the water was coming in from under his door. Luffy jumped to his feet instantly. He knew he needed to get out of there or he would drown, running to the door, which was a bit difficult since the ship was in such angle. Luffy stretched his arm out to open the door. It burst open, sending much more water in than the poor boy had imagined, sending him flying back inside the room. It took him a while to gather himself since the water had made him feel weak, but he managed to do it with some struggling. Then, he threw his hand out towards the door frame before grabbing it and letting his body snap towards it. Luffy was glad that he had managed to escape his room, but he knew that he wasn't out of danger yet. There was water everywhere and he knew that if it got up to his ankles, he would fall into a boneless heap to the floor. Deciding that he wasn't going to die in such stupid way, Luffy gathered his courage before reaching up to the ceiling boards where he could monkey his way outside instead of risking his feet getting wet. As Luffy got closer to the door leading on the deck, he could hear the shouts getting louder. He couldn't deny that he was feeling scared about going up there, but he felt like there wasn't really other options. Maybe he could hide on the deck somewhere? There were some big barrels gathered in one corner. Maybe he could hide himself behind them? Before Luffy could think another thought, the ship lurched once again, making him lose his grip and fall. Fortunately, he didn't fall on the floor, but on the stairs leading outside. He quickly thanked his luck before pushing himself up. He was surprised to find that even the steps were wet even though the water came from under the ship. He then noticed something different about the liquid. It wasn't water. This was something much thicker and much more sticky. Luffy lifted his hand up to examine what he had fallen into and was startled to notice that he was soaked in something dark and red. What is this? He asked to himself as he looked himself over. He then registered the strong smell the liquid had. Yes, the strong metallic stench. Luffy suddenly knew what it was. No way. This is all blood? He whispered as his body started to shake. He looked at the steps once again and saw how the liquid traveled down them like a river. He then lifted his gaze towards the slightly open door and saw that it was where all the blood was coming from. She deck right before the door. Luffy felt scared. Really scared. But when he once again remembered the water closing in on him, Luffy forced his legs to move. He felt disgusted when he felt how sticky the blood was becoming on him, but tried to focus on his task. Go outside, find Grandpa. Luffy finally reached the doorway and saw a scene he could never forget. The man lying in front of the door wasn't moving and he was covered in blood. Luffy could recognize the uniform he wore, however. It was a marine soldier. There was a deep, long wound on his back, clearly done by a sword. The wound was no longer bleeding. Luffy felt like he couldn't breathe when he slowly raised his gaze up to see the deck more. There was so much blood. Men were lying on the floor, lifeless, as some were still struggling against the unfamiliar men invading the ship. Luffy couldn't move. He could only stare ahead. He saw a marine fighting against one pirate with a sword and black cape. Unfortunately, the marine stood no chance against the pirate and he was quickly cut down. His blood sprayed as he fell on the floor with a pained shout. That was when Luffy's knees gave out. He couldn't even breathe anymore. But then the worst thing happened. The pirate turned to look at him. His stern eyes suddenly widened as his mouth fell open in shock. "A child," he shouted. Luffy was sure that he was going to get killed by this man. His heart was beating so strongly against his rib cage that he wondered if it would pop out. However, neither of them had time to do anything as another pirate ran behind the black-caped one. "Captain," he began. "This ship is going under. We need to get out of here." The man, apparently the pirate captain, asked, "Did you get him out?" Once he got a confirmation from his crew member, he nodded. "I understand, tell everyone to retreat." Luffy didn't have time to see the other pirate turn away as the ship once again lurched, sending the boy flying against the dead marine at the doorway. The movement caused his trance to break and his survival instincts to kick in. He ignored the blood that he had fallen into and stood up quickly before running away from the pirate. He had time to meet the pirate's gaze and was surprised to see him looking at him with startled and worried eyes. He was a pirate, right? Why would he look at him like that? And he had just killed so many marines. Why were his eyes so kind? Luffy didn't understand it, but he didn't want to. He wanted to find his grandpa. Unfortunately, luck wasn't on his side this time. The ship suddenly made the most violent lurch by far, almost turning the ship completely sideways. Luffy had no chance of staying upright and so he started falling. He could only scream as he flew past the pirate captain, right over the railing. He had barely enough time to register he had fallen overboard when he already hit the cool water and instantly knew that he hadn't taken a deep breath before falling in. Due to his long fall, Luffy kept sinking quickly. His strength was immediately robbed from him and he couldn't even try to save himself. He felt how his lungs were starting to scream for air already and he knew he couldn't hold on for long. He opened his eyes to look at the surface, wishing that he would see his grandpa diving to rescue him. However, only pieces of wood from their ship floated there. "I don't want this. Gramps, help," he silently wished. However, he could feel how his head was starting to hurt really bad and see how his vision was blurring. His limbs felt so heavy and useless. He squeezed his eyes tightly shut in pain before he finally had to let go. He felt water rushing into his lungs and he felt pained and sick. Then, his head started to feel strangely light. He couldn't think straight anymore. He opened his eyes and stared at his limp arms in front of him, they looking alien in the pale lighting. Then, in the middle of those useless limbs, he saw the water being disturbed as a dark figure slowly seemed to sink after him. No, it wasn't sinking, it was someone swimming towards him. "Gramps?" Luffy wondered before his vision went completely dark and he passed out. The next time Luffy woke up, he was in an unfamiliar place. His head throbbed as he slowly opened his eyes to look at the room and quickly decided that he wasn't on his grandpa's ship. Still, Luffy recognized the faint sway. He was definitely on a ship. He pushed himself up on the bed taking a note on how warm the blanket he had been sleeping under felt, and looked around. The room was quite big. There were big windows on one wall, though it was too dark to see anything out of them, and a wooden desk placed almost in the middle of the room. Someone had lit candles to light the room in a gentle glow, making Luffy feel calm and comfortable. He was just about to scan the rest of the room when a voice interrupted him. "Did you sleep well?" Luffy almost jumped when he heard the unfamiliar voice. He quickly spun around to see the pirate from before sitting on a chair, leaning his elbow on a table next to him. All the calmness Luffy had felt was instantly wiped away and he went rigid in fear. He saw quick flashbacks from what had happened on his grandpa's ship and he felt himself unable to breathe once again. He had been captured by pirates. "Why, you are that pirate from before," Luffy stuttered, his eyes wide and scared. However, the red-haired man only smiled softly, in a comforting manner almost. He then waved his hand slowly. Now. No need to get yourself worked up. I'm not going to hurt you." But you killed all those marines," Luffy said fearfully. The smile on the man's face lessened. "Yes, I did. But it was because they had taken one of our friends." Luffy pushed his lips and clutched the blanket on his lap tightly, wondering if he should speak. "What's your name, kid?" the pirate then asked. Luffy lifted his gaze to meet those dark and kind-looking eyes once again and somehow didn't feel so scared anymore. "Luffy," he answered. The pirate smiled even wider. "Luffy, huh? My name is Shanks." Luffy stared at the man, somehow finding it hard to believe his was the same man he had seen hurting that marine. "Shanks." Luffy tried out the name, making the said man smile softly. There was a short silence before Shanks took a sip of his drink he held in his other hand. Then, he locked his eyes with Luffy's again. "Tell me, Luffy, what were you doing on that marine ship?" Staring into the pirate's eyes, Luffy found himself unable to lie. "It's my grandpa's ship. He wanted to take me outside to see the sea." "Outside?" Shanks wondered before he focused on something else. "Your grandpa's ship? Luffy, are you saying that your grandfather is Monkey D. Garp?" Luffy's eyes went wide. "You know my gramps?" Shanks ran his hand through his red hair. His face twisted into a look of discomfort. "I've met him a few times." Luffy seemed happy about the news before all his positiveness seemed to fade away. A sorrowful look replaced his faint smile. "But the ship sank, didn't it? Did Gramps sink too?" he asked softly. Shanks opened his mouth to answer before closing it again. He wasn't really sure what to say. He wasn't really good with children and was uncertain if he should lie. He knew it was highly unlikely that anyone on the marine ship survived the battle, let alone swam for long enough for a rescue ship to arrive. Still, looking at Luffy's sorrowful eyes, Shanks was unable to tell him the hard truth. "Don't worry," he said instead and gave a big grin. "Your grandfather is really strong. He wouldn't die because of something like that, right?" Shanks felt a bit weird talking about a marine in such manner, But when he was rewarded with Luffy's happy smile, he was glad of every word he had said. "Yeah, Grandpa is really strong," Luffy exclaimed before seeming to remember who he was talking to and sinking back into the bed a bit. Shanks was satisfied when he noticed that Luffy was much more relaxed than when he had opened his eyes, although he still remained cautious in his seat. "Now, how about I get you something to eat? You must be hungry," he offered. Luffy seemed to consider it for a moment before giving a small smile and a nod. "Good, now wait here and I'll be back soon," Shanks said and left the room. From the crack of the door, Luffy could faintly see the deck of the unfamiliar ship and felt himself growing curious. What did the pirate ship look like up close? And they had a black flag with a Jolly Roger on it, right? What kind of flag did these pirates have? Though Luffy wanted to go on an adventure very badly, his fear of the unfamiliar men kept him from moving. He thought about his grandpa for a while, hoping that he was okay, before he thought how he had been about to drown. He could still remember how he sank deeper and deeper, and when he was just about to lose consciousness, he saw someone swimming towards him. Who had it been? Could it have been Shanks? Luffy wondered again why the pirate was so nice to him. He cheered him up and even offered him food. He hadn't even tried to hurt Luffy, not even once. Still, he couldn't ignore his memory of Shanks hurting the marine on his Gramps ship. The man had said that it was because the marines had their friend, but Luffy felt like it was still a horrible thing to do. But when Shanks returned with a tray of food and a wide smile, Luffy couldn't help but to think there was more to pirates than what his grandpa had told. So, Shanks started the next day when he and the child sat outside on the deck, Luffy sitting comfortably on the wide railing next to him. "You said you were traveling with your grandfather, but what about your parents?" Luffy munched on an apple as he stared at the clear waters. "Gramps said that my mom died when I was a baby and that my dad is a bad man. I have never met him though," the child answered without care, obviously not too interested about the subject. "So you live with your grandfather?" Luffy shook his head. "No, I live in a pretty weird place. Gramps comes to see me whenever he can." Shanks frowned. "A weird place?" "Yup," Luffy nodded before his small smile was gone again. "I don't like that place. They do these weird experiments." Luffy carefully pronounced the word before continuing, "on me. It really hurts sometimes," he admitted sadly and ran his hand over his arm. Shanks' frown deepened. This child was a test subject. What in the world did the Marines want with a small child like Luffy? "Why do they do those tests on you, Luffy?" Shanks asked carefully and never looked away from the boy's arm where he saw the small scars. Luffy pushed his lips together. "I don't really know. They said it was because they needed to see how my powers worked, but I don't know anymore," he said and sighed sadly. "Your powers?" Shanks asked. "Yeah, they told me to eat a fruit one day and then my body became weird. They said it was a devil fruit." "They fed you a devil fruit?" Shanks almost shouted. He was shocked. Forcing someone, a child, to eat the fruit and change their life was so very wrong. It made Shanks feel sick. "Yeah, the Gomu Gomu no Mi. I'm made of rubber because of that, see?" he said before stretching his cheek to an inhuman length. Shanks could only stare at the sight with his mouth wide open. Luffy let his skin snap back to its original place before rubbing the spot, as if it hurt. "What's wrong?" Shanks asked the child. "It just hurts a bit every time I stretch. They gave me some weird medicine so that it became like that." Hearing that, Shanks knew that Luffy could not be returned to the Marines. If this was the justice they seemed to love so much, then that justice had never been more wrong. Hurting an innocent child like this was so wrong and cruel. "Hey, Shanks." Luffy then started, causing the man to look up to him. The child seemed a bit nervous about asking the pirate, but was thankfully brave enough to do so. "Why are you a pirate?" Shanks was taken back by the question at first, but then he thought about it. "Let's see, it's fun, for one." Luffy frowned. "It's fun to hurt people." "No, it's not like that," Shanks laughed. "And there's much more to being a pirate than just hurting and robbing people." The child cocked his head. "What's that?" "To choose our way of living," Shanks told with a powerful, confident voice. "We are free men. We sail these seas and go on adventures and there is no one to tell us otherwise." Luffy's eyes widened and Shanks could see a new emotion emerging from inside of them that he hadn't yet seen from the boy. "Freedom," the boy stated silently, clearly in admiration and desire. Shanks nodded. Exactly. All of these men are free, he said and moved his hand to indicate his men on the ship, all more or less busy with something. Luffy watched them all, how they laughed and joked happily like they had no worries in the world. Like, they could do anything they wanted, go anywhere they wanted. And Luffy realized, they could. Just like those birds he watched every day from his tiny window of his room that felt like a cell, they could. Luffy started, making Shanks look at the boy. Luffy stared at all the happy faces on the ship and gulped down his words at first as if they were a bad thing to even think about. Shanks patiently waited until the child had finally gathered enough courage to say the words he had probably wanted to say for a long time now. I want to be free too. Like Shanks, like pirates. I don't want to go back to that small room anymore. I want to sail the seas too, he bravely said. His voice still sounded pleading, as if he was afraid, but Shanks could already see the kind of child Luffy was truly meant to be. A child of sea. Shanks put a hand on his trademark straw hat and smiled. Is that so? He then stood up, startling Luffy a bit, before grinning at the boy. Then, Luffy. Like Shanks would forever remember Luffy's plea of freedom, Luffy would always remember Shanks' next words. How about you become a pirate? Men, gather around, Shanks shouted loudly that evening as they were preparing for their almost daily banquet on the deck. Which more than a few men thought to be a bit too often. The crew gathered around their captain, who was now standing on a crate for him to be seen better. The red-haired pirate wore a satisfied grin as he held his hands on his waist. Listen up, I have an announcement to make, he started. He then leaned down before grabbing something and pulling the thing up, making whatever it was yelp, before lifting it up for all of the men to see. This here is Luffy, Shanks told, his grin still present on his face even as the boy, who he was holding up by his shirt, was struggling wildly against his grip. He's going to stay with us for a while, be nice to him, the man told and laughed. It took the crew a moment to react. After all, the boy in front of them was just a kid. Living with pirates wasn't really safe for a child like him. Then again, it was pretty darn fun. Yeah, some men cheered in unison and joined Shanks' laughter. The first mate, Ben Beckman, sighed at his captain's sudden decision before chuckling to himself. He could always count on Shanks to come up with new ways to surprise his crew. Shanks finally let the struggling Luffy go and watched as the boy crossed his arms and pouted. Watching the kid, the pirate captain seemed to remember something as he quickly raised his hand and turned back to his crew. I forgot to mention this, but make sure you are on your best behavior. You see, Luffy here is going to be looking up to all of you from now on, because he has told me that he will be a pirate one day. Isn't that right, Luffy? Shanks told before turning to look at the child again. Luffy's bad mood was quickly washed away by the sudden silence that fell at Shanks' words. He looked at the crowd of pirates that stared at him expectantly and understood that they were waiting for him to speak. Suddenly feeling really shy and a bit scared, Luffy took a step back, his shoulders rising high as he tensed. He then looked upward. The man was smiling kindly at Luffy, telling him that it was all right. Feeling a bit better, Luffy looked back at the men. He was going to say his dream. It was different from wishing it inside his head or telling it to Shanks. When he told it to these people, there was no going back. He would admit of wanting to be free, which he was never allowed before. But there were no Marines there. There were only pirates here, free men. No one would tell him not to wish anymore. Luffy swallowed once and opened his mouth. He felt himself trembling, but he steeled himself. He let his strong will guide him, and so he was able to speak. I want to be free. I want to sail the sea without anyone telling me not to. I want to be a pirate. Luffy shouted the last part, the words rising from deep inside his small body, full of meaning and strength. Shanks smirked at the boy's guts as the crew broke into loud cheers, everyone accepting the small kid as one of their own. After all, Luffy already had the most important feature a pirate needed: a strong will and a heart yearning for freedom. Luffy's first days at the red-haired pirate's ship had been full of amazement and joy. The boy, who had been a prisoner his entire life, had a lot to see and learn even while sailing through the sea without any land in sight. The pirates were more than happy to help him just so they could see Luffy's eyes start to sparkle at the simplest of things. Unfortunately, on the evening of his third day of his free life, Luffy received a horrible reminder of his former life. No one had had time to notice Luffy's quickly deteriorating health before the boy hadn't been able to stay standing and had suddenly collapsed. The boy had kept holding his chest and been in obvious pain as he had been carried to the small infirmary, though no one could see any injuries on the boy's body. It had only taken a few hours until a high fever had risen and Luffy's condition took a turn for the worse. It had taken too long for Shanks' liking for their doctor to figure out the reason for Luffy's sudden illness. It turned out that the small boy was suffering from no illness at all, but from extreme withdrawal symptoms. It was unclear to the doctor exactly what kind of medicine the boy had been forced to take up until then, and how Luffy's body could handle the lack of them. The only reassurance the doctor could offer was that Luffy was a healthy child and that whatever medication he had been fed, he didn't need. However, there was nothing else the man could do. He couldn't even give the boy any more medication in fear of causing an even worse reaction. The only thing he could do was tell that he'll be fine if he can survive the withdrawal symptoms. It was close to no help at all, but it was all that they were going to get. Time was the only thing that could heal Luffy. Shanks had stayed by the boy's bedside for the first night and almost the entire day that followed before he was joined by his first mate. Ben had knocked politely before entering the dark room to find his captain sitting sideways on a chair, partly leaning against the wall. His elbow was resting against the small table next to him so he could lean against his hand. An unlit cigarette hung from his lips as his eyes were tightly fixed on the small figure in his bed. Ben knew that his captain had noticed his presence, so he didn't start the conversation between them. He knew that even without talking, his captain would know what he wanted to ask. "I have never liked the Marines," Shanks finally began, his tired yet empty expression never changing. "But that has always been because we are enemies by nature. I have never really had any reason to hate them as an organization. I can understand what they are trying to accomplish. At least I thought so," he told before his eyes hardened. "But I see no good reason for them to capture a small child like Luffy and torture him like they did," he told with a low voice. "No matter what, there is nothing that can justify that." Ben could sense the rage inside of his captain without having to look at him. Though the man acted calm, there was a beast inside of him waiting for the moment to lash out. "No, I doubt there is," the first mate answered and turned his head towards the small figure laying on the bed. The boy's expression was pained, though he was asleep and his breaths were short and labored. It was clear that his suffering hadn't eased yet. "Luffy is strong," Shanks suddenly told. "He will be fine. He'll beat this." Ben was surprised to hear the man's voice waver ever so slightly. It didn't take long for Ben to realize that the strong pirate was only trying to reassure himself. It was a rare thing, but the red-haired captain was feeling scared. It was unclear to the first mate when the boy had been able to form such a bond with Shanks when the boy had only been on their ship for a few days. True, the boy's innocent wish and his difficult past were able to melt even the coldest heart, but Ben could not see anything more to him. Still, the first mate knew the power that came with wanting to protect someone, and he was not against seeing this new side of his captain. "Yes, I'm sure you will," Ben answered to give some support to his captain. "This kid," Shanks spoke again but seemed unsure how to continue. I want to protect his dream. I want him to get his freedom." Ben felt like it was the right moment to pry. "Any special reason?" There was a small smile on Shanks' face when he answered. "My life has always been much more simple. I have had my freedom from the day I was born. I became a pirate out of my free will, not because I had no other choice. I don't know if it's because he's a kid, but I want him to know what freedom is like," the man told before silently adding, "Maybe it's just for my own selfish reason of wanting to do something for him." Ben studied the man for a moment before giving a simple answer. "I see." The two of them stayed silent for a moment, listening to the only sound in the room: Luffy's labored breaths. Ben was the one to break that silence this time. "So you think that he can get his freedom only by becoming a pirate?" Shanks lowered his head at the question. "No," he then answered sincerely. "I thought about it before, but this life isn't for a kid. If he wants to fight for his freedom one day like us, then he can become a pirate, but until then his place isn't here. It's too dangerous." Ben was surprised by the calm and rational answer. Then Shanks shook his head wildly and held it in his hands as he let out a frustrated groan. "I don't know. I thought I was going to let him stay here until we found a good place for him to stay, but I don't feel like doing that anymore." Ben's eyes went wide at his captain's sudden outburst and was unable to say anything. Shanks turned to look at his first mate in the eye in desperation. "I mean, he has been so happy with us. And I want to teach him many things still. And he really loves the sea a lot and—" Ben sighed and put up a hand to stop the red-haired man's rambling. "Captain," he started and waited until he had the man's attention. "I understand that you don't want to give him up, but like you said, he is only a child." Ben looked at the unconscious child again and his eyes softened. Is it really a life he should be living? Shanks reacted like a child that had been scolded. His shoulders dropped, just like his head, and he pushed his lips together. His hands fell to his lap, and overall he looked quite defeated. "I know, I'll let him go. Once we find a good place for him to live, I will." Ben couldn't help but feeling a bit bad for his captain. Sometimes, emotions took control of the red-haired man, and it was his duty to help him make the right decisions during those times. It wasn't an easy duty, but a necessary one. The dark-haired man sighed and tried to give an encouraging smile. "The kid will probably want to be a pirate once he grows up, no matter what his life is like until then. He looks up to you after all. He'll be following you everywhere again in no time." The words seemed to slightly cheer up the captain. A smile, though a bit sad, spread on the man's face again. "Yeah, he'll be a great pirate one day." Luffy kept suffering from his high fever for days. Shanks had taken it as his duty to watch the boy's torment, no matter how painful it was. The most difficult moments were when Luffy was awake, delirious with fever. It was one of those moments that Shanks was staying by his side again, trying to hold the boy down as he fought against him, not even knowing who the man was. No, I can't be thrown out. I don't have my bird wings," the boy screamed as he struggled against Shanks' grip. "Luffy, it's all right. No one is throwing you anywhere." Shanks tried to calm the feverish boy and set him back on the bed, from where Luffy seemed to want to escape. You can't, it hurts," the boy kept screaming. Shanks knew that the boy wasn't really even conscious, but he still kept talking to him in a calming tone. "I'm sure it is, Luffy. You just need to be strong, okay? You will." Luffy's teary and confused eyes met with Shanks' kind ones before his strength ran out and he stopped struggling. The pirate captain rested the now limp small hands down on Luffy's lap before he laid the boy back down. The child stared at the red-haired pirate with glassy eyes, mumbling, "Strong." After that, he closed his eyes and fell asleep once more. Shanks sighed and ran a hand through his hair, sitting back on his chair. "How did I end up becoming a nurse?" he wondered for a moment. But looking at Luffy's sleeping figure again, he knew the answer. "It looks like I might be quite selfish after all," he told to the silent room. "Shanks." Luffy then muttered sleepily, his eyes still tightly closed as he slept on. The said man smiled and put a hand on Luffy's forehead. "Don't worry, I'm not throwing you anywhere." It had taken several painfully long days, but Luffy had finally recovered enough to walk around the ship again. The boy had been bewildered to see how everyone at the ship greeted him when he walked by, saying nice things like, "Good to see you up again," and, "Hi Luffy, are you feeling okay now?" He would then smile and answer them all with enthusiasm, feeling immensely happy about being the center of attention. The crew was relieved to see how the child had recovered, but even more so when they saw how good their captain was looking again as he walked behind the kid. The man wasn't looking tired any longer and his shoulders had finally relaxed, just like his expression had. All the earlier anger that they had seen was gone and replaced by a tranquil look, a calm smile resting on his face constantly. When Luffy ran up the stairs and tripped, it was Shanks who lifted him back to his feet. When the crew saw how Luffy thanked their captain and ran on ahead of the man, they couldn't help but to see a father and son there. "Shanks, look!" Luffy shouted once he had reached the bow of the ship and looked over the railing. Shanks slowly made his way behind the boy. "What is it?" he asked and followed his gaze to where Luffy was pointing. Unfortunately, he could only see the calm sea and a few birds. "I can't see what you mean." "The birds," Luffy shouted as he watched the white seagulls gliding over the surface of water, waiting for the right time to dive in and catch their prey. "Aren't they cool? They can go anywhere. They can just fly away anytime they want," he exclaimed. Shanks smiled at the boy's enthusiasm for something so simple. "But Luffy, don't you remember?" he asked and waited until the child met his gaze. He looked confused before Shanks explained. "You're free now too. You can go anywhere, just like those birds." Luffy's eyes widened as he realized Shanks' words. "Oh yeah," he said and turned back to look at the birds. Then, he lifted his hand and waved at them. "I don't need wings after all. I'm free now too." Luffy shouted loudly at the birds as he wore the biggest smile Shanks had ever seen on the boy's face. The pirate captain smiled at Luffy's words and knew that everyone on the ship had heard them as well. He heard someone sniffling behind him and looked over his shoulder to see Usopp wiping his tears away. It was no wonder, Shanks thought. Luffy had gone through some horrible things up until then, and knowing that, his innocent words resounded even stronger inside of them. Shanks saw how a shadow passed the ship under the water and watched how the birds gathered into one spot. He quickly understood what was going on, and so he placed a hand on Luffy's shoulder. "Look closely, Luffy," he told the child, making him lean closer to the railing in curiosity. Soon, even Luffy could see the several shadows that swam underneath the surface. It only took a moment before the surface of the water was broken and a big whale jumped up. It was followed by 2 other whales, all spraying water high in the air. "Wow!" Luffy shouted as he watched the scene. His eyes glimmered with childish glee and excitement, just like they should have. Shanks rested his arms on the railing and leaned into them, enjoying the moment of peace. The sun was shining. Luffy was healthy and happy again. Nothing could have been better. Or maybe if he had a bottle of rum. In order to celebrate Luffy's recovery, the crew arranged a surprise party that evening. Unlike usual, the ship was lit with several paper lamps that were tied onto ropes and tied to the masts on both ends of the ship, creating a nice glow on the deck. Oil lamps were lit wherever they could be put, and blankets and carpets were laid on the floor, not only to become a more comfortable place to sit on, but to make the wooden deck more colorful. To top things off, the captain's spot got a pile of pillows. Though no one admitted they were actually for the little kid that hung onto the red-haired man like a baby chimp. And a grill was wheeled outside, as well as a table that was slowly starting to fill with food. The men had never gone through so much trouble to have a party on the ship, but once they saw the look on Luffy's face as he came to the deck, they regretted nothing. The boy's eyes opened wide, just like his mouth, before his eyes started to glimmer with excitement. "Wow, it's so pretty," he exclaimed, and seemed to barely be able to contain his feelings. It was clear by the way his little body shook that he wanted to just run around and look at everything, but instead the boy held onto the dark pant leg of the man he stood next to. The red-haired man looked quite impressed himself, whistling in approval as he looked around the deck. He didn't pay attention Luffy's reaction, but instead just grinned at his crewmates, who were waiting for their captain's command. "Men," he started, getting everyone's attention, "let's party." The men let out a strong, agreeing shout loud enough to cause Luffy to jump. The next moment, the deck was bustling. A group had clearly taken it as their duty to make the food, whereas one group had an idea how to play some instruments. Some were getting drinks and some were already having a blast, choosing a place to sit at and laughing and joking loudly. Luffy looked at the lively deck for a moment, his feet stuck in their place. Shanks looked down and saw this, smiled and grabbed the boy underneath his arm. "Come on, Anchor, it's your party." The boy tried to wiggle out of the man's grasp. "Anchor? My name isn't Anchor, it's Luffy," the boy told in annoyance, completely having forgotten his earlier nervousness as the two made their way among the other pirates. Shanks laughed at the child. "You sink like one, so you're Anchor," the man laughed again before continuing. "Well, think of it as a nickname." The boy looked up at the red-haired man in confusion. "A nickname?" Before he could answer, the other pirates guided the captain to his spot that had thoughtfully been placed so that all the other men would remain in front of them, making it a bit more calm place, and the man threw Luffy to the big pile of pillows. The boy easily disappeared in the soft pile with a soft poof. The red-haired man sat down and waited for the boy to climb his way out while getting served his first drink of the evening. When Luffy's head became visible again, the boy was giggling uncontrollably. "Look, Shanks. It's a castle," the boy told excitedly and held one pillow high above his head to show it. The red-haired man looked at the boy for a moment before being unable to contain his laughter. "Your castle is a bit brittle, Anchor," the man teased. Luffy glared at the man and puffed his cheeks. "You're just jealous you're not as small as me," the boy told before seemingly remembering something. "And don't call me Anchor. My name is Luffy." The captain stopped laughing and smiled at the boy. I told you, it's a nickname I gave you. The boy's angry look was gone in a second and was replaced by confusion. What's that? Shanks looked surprised by the boy's question. You don't know what a nickname is? The boy shook his head. Shanks placed a hand underneath his chin and thought about an answer. Well, a nickname see from your friends. It's just a form of affection, Shanks explained. Luffy's eyes widened. His mouth opened once before closing. He repeated the same action a few times as Shanks kept an eye on him, waiting patiently for him to say something. Finally, what came out of Luffy's mouth was, friends. Shanks smirked at the quiet word. That's right, we're friends. Nakama, as we like to call it here, the man told the boy and watched his reaction. Luffy's eyes suddenly looked like they didn't know where to look, and he started to fumble with the hem of his shirt, his mouth opening and closing rapidly. Then, his feelings took the best of him and he disappeared into his castle of pillows, not able to look at the pirate captain in the eye. Shanks was both surprised and amused by the boy's actions, and he lay back to rest against his own pile of pillows while softly laughing at him. What's wrong? Did you get scared about being a pirate's friend? There was a short pause before Shanks heard a soft mumble. I've never had a friend before. Once his first surprise had passed, a sympathetic smile rose onto Shanks' face. I see, he answered the boy, already figuring out the reason for Luffy not having had a friend before. He had been some sort of marine test subject. It was unlikely the boy had been able to have normal human interaction with anyone besides his grandfather. While it was a sad fact, Shanks was determined to keep it in the past. Come here, Luffy, Shanks called for the boy and waited until the small raven-haired boy had half-crawled next to him from inside the pile of pillows. The boy looked at the man a bit shyly, waiting for what he was going to do. Look there, Shanks told the child, indicating the party in front of them. The boy did as he was told, looking at the loud group of men clearly having the time of their lives. Some were singing, some dancing, some laughing at each other's antics. They were having fun. All of us are your friends already, Luffy, Shanks told the boy. Luffy kept staring at all the happy, free men for some time, not quite being able to believe Shanks' words. However, once it sunk into his head that Shanks wouldn't lie to him, Luffy took a shaky breath in and blinked for several times as he kept staring ahead. My friends. Luffy spoke softly, as if being afraid of wishing for something like it. Shanks smiled at the boy. He knew that Luffy would become a strong, confident kid one day. He had already seen a flash of that side of him, but Shanks knew it would take some more time for Luffy to be able to let go of his past and move forward. Maybe his time on their ship would turn out to be a good experience for him in that sense? A good scent traveled across the deck to the two of them and Luffy inhaled the scent hungrily, his small mouth starting to water. One day the kid would be shouting for food right about then, but for now, he just kept staring at the table full of everything delicious like a hungry dog. Shanks chuckled at the boy and raised his hand up. Bring us some of that meat, will you? Someone by the grill moved to put a big serving of meat on a plate and was about to bring it to their captain when he was stopped by Usopp. Wait, you need to put some vegetables in there too. Luffy is a growing boy. Eating only meat is bad for him. The pirates laughed at Usopp's words, pointing out that his fatherly instincts were kicking in, but did as the other pirate had told. Soon, the big plate was brought in front of the two and Luffy wasted no time in digging in once Shanks encouraged him to do so. The boy was so focused on eating that he didn't notice how all of the crew members were looking at him with kind smiles. The party went on for hours and hours after that. The men ate and drank, sang and danced while their captain watched them from his spot. Luffy had fallen asleep at one point and had nestled in between a pile of pillows and his secretly favorite friend. Shanks had placed a blanket on the boy, knowing that he had only just recovered. He didn't want the kid to get sick again, even if the night was a warm one. Shanks sipped on his drink, not quite feeling like getting too drunk, just enjoying watching his crewmates enjoying themselves. It was then that Shanks' first mate approached him. The dark-haired man sat down next to his captain wordlessly, knowing that his captain wouldn't object. There is something you ought to know about that kid. Ben started and glanced at the sleeping child by Shanks' side. Shanks turned his attention to the man. Is it about why he was held by the Marines? Ben nodded and crossed his arms. I did some digging. It seems like you picked up a troublesome one this time, Captain. Shanks frowned and placed his drink on the floor. What did you find out? The first mate looked at the child with concern as he answered, "He is much more than just a test subject for the Marines." It might be hard to believe, but that kid is the sole reason the entire world isn't at war right now. "What?" Shanks hissed, unable to believe what he had just heard. He glanced at the other crew members, making sure none of them had been listening. Ben nodded and continued, "He is the son of the most dangerous man alive, Dragon the Revolutionary, and he has been used as a political piece ever since he was captured right after his birth. I don't know the details, but it seems like the world government has been using his life to control Dragon's movements for the last 5 years." "And the experiments they did on him?" Shanks asked, still not seeing a reason to hurt the child. Ben closed his eyes and let out a heavy sigh. Not a part of the deal. It was probably their way of directing their anger. Shanks stared at the other man for the longest time, clearly trying to digest everything he had been told. Then, he rested his forehead against his palm for a moment, letting out a long sigh. The two of them stayed silent for a while, the only sound being the loud laughs of the partying crew, before Ben spoke again. "The Marines will be wanting that kid back. You don't need me to tell you that whether he stays here or gets left somewhere, they will find him eventually." Shanks let his hand fall over his mouth as he thought about the situation. He then looked down at the small bundle by his side and couldn't help a smile rising to his face. "Luffy is my friend already. I can't let him go through those horrible experiences again." Ben looked at his captain carefully. "You think his life will be better here with us?" Shanks' eyes narrowed. "I'm not sure, but I do know that it's better than having to dream of freedom day after day, knowing that you can never get it." Ben stayed silent, just looking at his captain. "You do realize what you are doing?" "I have a general idea." Shanks sighed and rested against the pillows behind him. There was a pause before Ben stated the obvious, "With this, you're not going against just the Marines, but the world government, just for one child." Shanks laughed at his first mate's words before meeting his gaze. There was a gleam in Shanks' eyes that the first mate could recognize. It was strong, feral, almost. "I've been prepared to go against the world the day I became a pirate," the red-haired captain told, his voice low though there was a smile on his face. Ben smirked. Even though he had been with his captain for more years than he could count, the man could still make his blood boil just by one look. It was one reason he still stayed by his side even after all the stupid things the man tended to do. "It looks like things are going get busy from now," Ben said, but didn't seem too bothered by the fact. The captain's expression turned dramatic as he sighed. "When did my life get so damn complicated?" Ben could easily tell that the man was just faking it. He loved these exciting things that came along his pirate life, though this was the first time the captain was going to risk so much for someone who he has just met. It was unlike him and just like him at the same time. Whatever happened from then on, he knew where he was going to stay, by his captain's side, protecting the small child the man had taken under his wing. Luffy recognized the strange smell in the air. It was a strong smell which he couldn't name. The only thing he knew about it was that he hated it and it screamed danger. His feet felt cold as he was being walked through a long hallway without any proper clothing. They had dressed him in the stupid gown again. That and only that. The icy coldness beneath his feet slowly spread through his small body and Luffy tried to hug himself to stay warm. His steps slowed, but not for long as he was pushed forward by one of the two big men who were escorting him, making him yelp and stumble. Luffy hated it. Every moment of it. He wanted to run because he knew what was coming next. He would walk through the cold hallway, all the way to the end, where there would be a big iron door. The door would open and then... Suddenly, he was in front of the door. Luffy gasped. He didn't want to be there yet, he wasn't ready. The door was opened. Tens of white-gloved hands reached out for him and even though he tried to run, they grabbed him and pulled him inside. Luffy screamed for his grandfather to come and save him, he never did. Before he noticed, he was strapped to a table with a lamp above his head, so bright that hurt his eyes. The horrible smell was even stronger now. Luffy felt like he couldn't breathe, he was scared. "No, no," he tried to shout, "stop it." The people around him paid him no heed and started to calmly discuss about things Luffy didn't understand. He tried to struggle against his restraints but it was no use, he couldn't escape, he never could. Then, there was a needle being pointed at him. "No," Luffy tried to protest, but the needle was faster. It dug into his skin on his neck. Then, Flames ignited inside of him. He was burning. Screaming didn't help. The flames wouldn't go away. It hurt, and it kept hurting. The pain grew worse and he felt like all his blood was ablaze. "Help me, Shanks!" Luffy shouted. The name suddenly hit him back. "Shanks?" he asked into a sudden darkness, and the pain disappeared in a flash. He took a deep breath, desperate as if he had never taken a breath before, and opened his eyes. It was dark. He wasn't in the horrible room anymore. He wasn't being held down. He wasn't burning inside. Luffy sat up and tried to calm his breathing. He kept telling himself over and over again it was just a dream, and hugged himself. Once he had been able to calm down a little, Luffy looked across the room, where Shanks' bed was. The man was snoring loudly, his other arm hanging over the edge of the bed while he kept drooling onto his pillow. He had clearly not been bothered by anything that had just happened. Luffy looked down at his hands. He could still feel the pain of all the experiments he had had to go through. He rubbed his hands together and tried to warm himself up. The cold feeling of his dream was still not gone, nor were the quick beats of his heart. For a small moment, Luffy wondered if Shanks would mind if he would go to sleep next to him. The boy shook away the thought. He didn't want to bother the man with his silly nightmares. He had always been able to forget his nightmares alone. Well, maybe not all alone. He had always had Admiral Wolf with him. Gramps had brought him with him when Luffy had been a baby. Admiral Wolf couldn't speak or move, but Luffy loved him a lot. The plush toy was big and cuddly and it was always able to make Luffy forget about his nightmares. But even he was gone now. Admiral Wolf had sunk along with his grandfather's ship. Luffy clutched his blanket and brought it up to his face. Tears started to gather in his eyes and his lower lip started to quiver. Admiral Wolf. Luffy hid his face, knowing that he would start crying soon. He felt really lonely. He wanted someone to make him feel better. He wanted to forget about his nightmare and wanted to not miss his Gramps so much. Missing someone made him feel so much more lonely. And that's how Luffy found himself standing next to Shanks' bed, clutching his pillow tightly to hold back his tears. He held his head down as he started to poke the red-haired man, too ashamed to make a sound. He knew that the man might tease him for what he was doing, but he just felt so bad right now and the only one he knew could make things better was Shanks. The man groaned after Luffy's 20th poke and opened his eyes. He blinked for several times before he could recognize the boy. "Luffy?" the man asked, his voice hoarse. Luffy stared down at his feet and shuffled them in embarrassment. He was afraid to let out a sound, and when he tried, a single sob escaped him. The sound made Shanks sit up and face the boy. "Hey, what's wrong?" the man asked, sounding genuinely worried. Luffy reluctantly spoke, "There was a nightmare and Admiral Wolf is gone and..." By this time Luffy couldn't hold back his sobs and his words became incomprehensible. The only words Shanks could somehow make out were scared, and his own name. He had seen the kid cry for a few times, yes, but not quite like this. The man smiled down at the crying boy and scooped him up from the floor. The boy grabbed onto his shirt instantly and wailed against his chest. Shanks sat there for a moment, just telling Luffy reassuring things and stroking his hair. The boy eventually calmed and went almost completely lax in the man's arms, exhausted by all the crying he had done. Shanks wordlessly picked up Luffy's pillow from the floor and placed it next to his own before carefully resting the boy's head on it. Luffy stared at the red-haired man tiredly as the man settled down next to him. Shanks smiled at Luffy reassuringly. "Go to sleep, Anchor. I'll keep watch." Luffy smiled as an answer and snuggled into his pillow, finally feeling safe. It only took a moment before the boy was fast asleep. Shanks laughed at himself inside. He had no idea when he had become so good at handling children. He grabbed his blanket and draped it over himself and the boy next to him, offering one more smile before resting his own head down to sleep. The next morning, Luffy was up and about before Shanks had even cracked open an eye. The boy was feeling energetic and was eager to explore the ship some more and talk to the nice pirates on the ship. That's how Luffy ended up running towards the door. When he got out onto the deck, he was surprised to find that the sky had turned dark, almost black, and a strong wind was picking up. Luffy stared at the sky in awe. It looked really cool in his opinion, and there was something in the air that he couldn't place. It was something strong and it felt alive. "Luffy," Someone called and the child turned his head to see Lucky Roo approaching him. The man was almost running, which Luffy found to be a funny-looking sight considering the man's big size. When he reached the boy he asked kindly, "What are you doing here? Did you just wake up?" Luffy smiled and nodded. "Yeah, Shanks is a lazy bum so he's still sleeping." Roo was taken back by Luffy's choice of words. "Lazy bum? Who told you that?" Lucky Roo was sure it didn't belong to a child's vocabulary, though he wouldn't really know. "I heard one guy say it, Grog Greppa Grebo something was his name," the boy proudly told. Roo only gave a laugh. "I see. Now how about we get some breakfast?" It's going to start raining soon," the man told and started leading the child towards the galley. Luffy's eyes went wide. "It's going to start raining?" Roo was surprised by Luffy's reaction. "Yeah, you can smell in the air already, anytime now." Luffy looked at Roo as they walked across the deck before he turned his head to look at the dark sky. "That's cool." "The rain?" Roo asked. "Yeah, Gramps took me to the garden one day when it rained and my clothes got all wet. It was weird." Roo laughed at the child's enthusiasm. "I see, then how about we come outside and play once we have finished breakfast?" Luffy's eyes lit up instantly. "Really? We can?" Roo nodded. "Of course, you can do anything you want now, remember?" Luffy's grin stretched to his "Yeah, 'cause I'm free." "That's right," Roo told and ruffled Luffy's hair. As the two went into the galley, the man could hear the familiar pitter-patter of the rain falling onto the deck. The galley was filled with light and warmth. The two got themselves big, pirate breakfasts, as Luffy would call them, and sat down among other members of the crew. Roo was happy to notice that Luffy was feeling more comfortable with everyone and didn't shy away when they would ask him questions. The child chatted away with some of the men and ate his breakfast with enthusiasm. "I wonder if there's going to be a storm?" someone asked. Luffy was about to ask about it when a certain red-haired pirate joined them. Shanks ruffled Luffy's hair as he sat down next to the boy. "So this is where you were, Anchor," the man greeted the child. Luffy looked at the man and saw that his shirt was dotted with darker spots. "Shanks, did you get wet?" Luffy suddenly shouted when he understood that the man might have gotten wet from the rain, startling more than a few men in the galley. Shanks blinked at Luffy a few times. Yeah, I did." Stars appeared in Luffy's eyes and his tiny fists clenched tightly. "That's so cool." The red-haired pirate sweat dropped and tried to wrap his mind around Luffy's reaction. "You like rain?" Luffy nodded furiously. "I like it." Shanks held back a laugh and ran a hand through his hair as he settled into his seat better. "We'll check it out once I've filled my stomach, okay, kid?" From that moment on, Luffy kept fidgeting in his seat, anxious to run out to play in the rain. When Shanks had finally finished his breakfast, the child jumped up and latched onto Shanks' shirt. "Let's go! Let's go!" The child kept chanting until the man finally got up from his seat. I get it. We're going," the man told a bit reluctantly. He wasn't really feeling as excited as Luffy was. When they were at the door, Roo called his captain's name. When the man turned, two dark objects were thrown at him. He caught them and saw that they were two of the raincoats they kept around. However, one had clearly gone through some sort of surgery. Roo looked proud of himself as he explained, "I cut one of them to fit Luffy better. It's still not really his size, but it should be better than nothing." Shanks gave a grateful look and thanked the man before telling Luffy to lift his arms so he could put on the coat. The boy's head disappeared underneath the big hood, but he only seemed to be enjoying the new clothing he had received as he kept giggling wildly as he tried to look around. Shanks put on his raincoat and asked someone to draw the two of them a bath since he knew they would be needing it. And he was right. Luffy was like a small animal once he had held out his hands for a little while and understood that yes, rainwater was wet. He started to run around, laughing loudly while jumping up and down. It was no wonder that Luffy kept falling down repeatedly, but the boy didn't seem to mind as he would just jump up again and run some more. To Shanks, there was nothing more amusing than this. Luffy's energy seemed endless, but Shanks knew that the fun had to end at some point or they would both end up in the sickbed. Right when Shanks had been about to call out to the boy, Luffy had been leaning over the railing, and was it not for Shanks' quick reflexes, the boy would have been lost in the dark waters. "I think that's enough for today," Shanks told as he was holding Luffy from his arm to keep him from falling. He pulled the boy up, and once he was sure the boy was okay, which he was, The little idiot didn't seem to be too fazed by his near-death experience. Shanks led Luffy towards the bathroom. The two had a bath, which didn't turn out to be very relaxing as Luffy kept splashing the water and playing around, before dressing themselves and going back to Shanks' room. The rest of the day Luffy lay on Shanks' bed and watched the rain fall. He made it seem like the most interesting thing in the world as his gaze never left the window. The red-haired captain silently wished he could have spent his day typically, drinking some ale and not worrying about anything, but being painfully sober, he remembered that he had duties of a captain. So he sat at his desk and planned their voyage as well as checked their financial situation. He called in a few people who would tell how much supplies they had and if there was anything specific they needed. All in all, it took surprisingly a lot of time, and by the time he was finished a storm had formed around the ship. It had started as a faint rumbling sound. The sound slowly grew louder and was accompanied by bright, flashing lights. Luffy could see how the lighting hit the ocean far behind them over and over again. It was nothing like he had seen before. His eyes were fixed to the window and he had a concentrated look on his face. Shanks noticed this and leaned back in his chair. "Do you like thunder?" the man asked. Luffy didn't move to answer. "Yeah, it's cool," he answered, but was too focused to keep up a conversation. Shanks chuckled and stood up from his seat. "I see, then you won't mind me going outside for a moment, will you?" Luffy hummed and answered, "Nope." Shanks smiled and grabbed his raincoat from where he had put it to dry. He looked back at the child and just held the door handle for a moment. "I'll be back soon. Don't go out right now, okay?" Shanks told. The child answered with a happy, "I get it," and Shanks left the room. Unfortunately, the storm got worse and soon it was an all-hands-on-deck situation. Well, all hands but the very smallest ones. The ship rocked violently as the rain kept pouring down. Luffy had crept under the blankets and tried to hold onto the bed, which was fixed to the floor, as hard as he could. The lighting kept flashing even more frequently than before, and the loud rumble kept growing louder. Luffy tried to convince himself that he wasn't afraid. He hadn't ever been afraid of thunder, it was just that this storm was a lot worse than the ones he had seen. There was also the fact that he was all alone. No Gramps, no Admiral Wolf, no Shanks. Suddenly, there was a horribly loud sound. Luffy put his hands to his ears and tried to block it, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. A cold feeling passed Luffy at the same time as he relieved a sudden memory. The memory of his grandpa's ship. Luffy was back in the ship again as it was under attack and the cannonballs kept hitting the ship, making it rock. He scrambled up and quickly hid under the bed again. This time he would listen to his Gramps. He wouldn't come out until it was safe. Maybe he could see him again then? Maybe it was because he was bad that Gramps had disappeared in the first place? There was another loud sound and Luffy couldn't help when a scream escaped him. That scream turned into a sob and soon, the boy was crying his eyes out all alone underneath the bed. It was only when the loud sounds had started to fade and the ship's movement had calmed that the red-haired pirate returned to the room. "Sorry Luffy, the storm was a bit stronger than we expected. They needed me to." Shanks had put his raincoat to dry and turned around to see an empty room. "Luffy?" he asked. He could soon hear whimpering from somewhere and it didn't take him long to pinpoint where the sound came from. He walked over to the bed and crouched. "Luffy, are you okay?" The boy kept crying but slowly turned his head to look at his savior. Shanks," the boy stuttered, his big eyes wide with fear. Shanks was confused at first, but he soon realized that it was Luffy's first time experiencing a storm at the sea. It was much more intense than on land. It was no surprise the kid was freaked out. "Sorry, I stayed out too long. Come here," the man told and held out his hand. Luffy's lips started to tremble even more than it already was and he launched himself towards the red-haired man, throwing the both of them onto the floor. The boy cried against Shanks' chest. Just Lakil the man quickly gathered himself enough to hold the boy with one arm. "I thought you were gone too," the boy cried, though his words were barely comprehensible. "What do you mean?" Shanks asked in confusion. "'Cause Gramps is gone too. I thought that you would disappear just like him." Shanks looked at the child in his arms sadly. "But I waited this time. I didn't want you to be gone too, so I waited," the child kept explaining. "Luffy," Shanks started, "don't tell me you think it's your fault that your grandfather is." "But I was bad." Luffy interrupted. I didn't wait for him at all. And now he's gone. Shanks swiftly lifted himself off the floor along with Luffy and placed the boy on his bed before crouching before him and holding his small hands. His expression was serious as he stared into the boy's eyes. Listen to me, Luffy. We are the reason your grandfather's ship sank. It's not your fault, okay? Don't ever think it's your fault. Luffy looked a bit frightened for a moment, but then he nodded and looked at his hands. Shanks let out a small sigh and smiled. Come on then, you must be hungry. The men started to prepare for dinner just now. He stood and leaned closer to Luffy before lifting the boy up into his arms. The boy put his arms around Shanks' neck and hid his teary, red eyes into the man's shoulder. Shanks would have made fun of the boy if it weren't for the fact he was 5. Instead, he just held onto the boy tightly as he quickly ran across the deck to the galley. While it was a surprise to all the members of the crew to see Luffy in such a state, they were able to quickly turn on their happy faces to cheer up the child. It didn't take long until Luffy's smiling face was back again, but the boy was still too content in Shanks' lap to move from there for the rest of the evening. Don't you think you've gone soft, Captain? The first mate teased his captain. The two of them were alone on the deck during that night, Shanks having joined Ben on his watch. The moon was almost full and it shined brightly on the cloudless sky, illuminating the lone ship as well as making a bridge on the dark ocean. The two men stared at the calm waters, leaning against the railing in silence. Soft? What are you talking about? Shanks asked without looking at the other man. A golden light flickered against Ben's face for a moment as he lit his cigarette. I'm talking about the kid, the taller man told, resting his forearms against the railing like his captain was. You've changed since you picked him up. A sour look crossed Shanks' face and he childishly avoided his first mate's eyes. Not really. Ben resisted the urge to laugh at his captain. The man was becoming a father figure for Luffy, yet he himself was no better than a child. Which brought him to his next question. You're going to have to raise him, you know. Shanks glanced at the taller man and let his face sink into his arms for a moment. When he looked up at the horizon again, his expression was a mix of many emotions. Ben was able to read the man relatively easily. Shanks had known the fact that keeping Luffy with them would bring a lot of problems in the future. He knew what they were going up against and for what. Yet, for this one child, Shanks had decided to risk it all. He was taking responsibility for his entire crew's lives, but also Luffy's. The kid no longer had the chance to have a normal life. No, he had never that chance in the first place. But now, he would have to learn how to live as a pirate. It was far from a normal life. While staying with them for who knows how long, the kid would have to see death for many more times before he was going to even be at the age to process it properly. The only one who could keep the kid from breaking was the one existence he valued over everyone else, Shanks. I know, the red-haired man told quietly, his eyes shining with honesty. Yet, there was also a deep sadness in those eyes as well as the emotion Ben rarely saw in the man, uncertainty. Ben had been ready to rant about the many reasons why it was a bad idea to keep a kid with them, just to make sure his captain fully understood what he was doing. However, seeing the look on his captain's face, the first mate knew that the man had already thought about it all. That's why he stayed silent, just standing by his captain's side like usual. To be honest, I'm feeling unsure. I have no idea what it's like to raise a kid. None of us do. And Luffy is. He's so small. He's been through a hell we can only imagine. How am I supposed to help him? How can I make sure he can grow up to be strong one day? All of that fell on my shoulders, Shanks told and looked at his first mate in desperation. He doesn't have anyone else. While seeing his strong captain in such a lost state was quite startling, Ben couldn't help but be reminded of the man's childish moments. He, like many times before, put a hand on the red-haired man's shoulder to reassure him. Don't worry about it so much. It's not like you're alone. This crew isn't here just to fight battles for you. You can count on everyone here. Shanks' eyes widened for a moment before his expression softened and a small smile appeared. He took a breath and nodded a few times. You're right. It's a bit different this time, but I'm not alone. That's right. Shanks turned back to look at the ocean before laughing. Raising a kid, huh? I sure didn't plan on doing that yet, if ever, the man told and laughed once again. Ben just smiled silently. But I'm sure that it can't be that hard. Luffy is a good kid after all. He'll be a great pirate yet. We'll make sure of that. Ben couldn't help when a dark thought crossed his mind, extinguishing his smile. I sure hope so. Shanks could hear the uncertainty in the man's voice, which made him look at him in question. The taller man thought about not telling what was in his mind for a moment before deciding against it. He had his duty as a first mate to think about. The Marines probably think Luffy died during that attack against Vice Admiral Garp. We still have that advantage. But what about when they find out Luffy is with us? Ben let the question hang in the air for a moment, watching how his captain stared at him intently. Luffy is more important to the Marines than we can imagine, Ben explained. If they find out he's alive, there's no way they will let him go. They will do everything in their power to get him back. Ben locked his eyes with his captain's. You said you would protect him, but what then? What about when they realize that they can't have him back? How do you think the Marines will respond? Shanks stayed silent, waiting for his first mate to continue. Luffy is a proof of their twisted sense of justice. Not only does he have the blood of the worst criminal in the world, but he is also the very reason peace existed for 5 years. They will make sure his father will never know he isn't in their grasp any longer. You mean? Ben nodded. The two didn't continue the conversation for any longer. When Ben's cigarette had long since gone out, Shanks finally spoke again. He looked determined as he stared ahead, the moon's light creating a dangerous gleam inside of his eyes. That doesn't change what we want to do. Luffy will stay with us until he is strong enough to protect his own freedom. Until then, we will protect it for him. Ben stared ahead at the dark horizon. Yes, but for now, we must buy time. The two stayed on the deck for hours, both staying completely silent until the sun started rising. Shanks only left when he remembered that he no longer could only worry about his own life, there being a small life in his room who he had vowed to protect. And apparently, it would take a lot more than just keeping the boy alive. He needed to feel safe, protected, happy. If that meant that Shanks had to be there when Luffy woke up, then that was what he would do. He had taken up the duty, and no matter how troublesome it would be, he would see it to the end. Though, seeing Luffy's radiant up and saw him there was not half bad, Shanks decided. Somehow, the future, however dark it would become, didn't seem so threatening when the kid smiled. The sky had never looked bigger than it did on that day. The white, thin patches floating over the deep blue created a beautiful contrast over the ocean, which was so calm that it mirrored the image above it almost perfectly. From the small ship sailing through it all, it looked as if there was no end to the horizon. No land to ever come in sight. The men aboard knew differently, however, and though the world around them was as beautiful as it could ever be at such an unpredictable sea, there was little peace in their mind. The lower deck had been bustling with life the entire morning as every crew member had done their part in preparing for upcoming docking, and once their tasks had been done, the energy left over from all the excitement had left the men feeling impatient. Thankfully, a small distraction had appeared on the deck at that moment. It was someone who was almost an expert in having too much energy. It hadn't taken a lot of time before the men had all joined in to a playful game of tag. The ship was quickly filled with one child's gleeful shrieks and giggles as well as the soft laughs of the men. It was a sound none of them had heard before on their ship before, and sailing through such beautiful view accompanied by that sound made them all feel a bit more pure despite who they were. The captain and his first mate stood on the higher level and watched the scene in front of them. They both had relaxed against the railing in front of them, letting themselves stop and enjoy the moment. The breeze was almost non-existing and the sun warmed their skin in a gentle way. For the smallest minute, it seemed as if the time had stopped just to give them this day to enjoy in peace. Shanks watched as Usopp made a face at Luffy, urging the child to chase after him before hiding behind the mast for a second until the boy ran after him. The boy tried to catch the laughing man, who kept running around the deck. Eventually, the man faked that they tripped on something so that Luffy was finally able to touch him. The proud smile on the boy's face caused a smile to spread onto Shanks' face as well. It's good to see he's getting along with everyone now, Ben said, ending the long silence the two of them had shared. Shanks kept looking at Luffy and his men who had all reverted back into being children again. He sighed contentedly, yeah. An amused smile spread on Ben's face as he watched as Lucky Roo took his turn to act clumsy during his chase after Luffy, causing everyone to laugh loudly. He used to be clinging onto you up until now. It seems like he can't even remember you around now, Ben teased. but received no more than a gentle smile in return from the red-haired man. "No," the captain started as he kept looking at the child, who right at that moment turned around to wave at the man. "He knows I'm here." Ben chuckled at the two, still finding the connection between them unbelievable in many sense. The two settled back into a peaceful silence, letting the ship glide through the calm ocean carrying laughter and joy. Slowly, time started moving again in the minds of the two men, and the heavy ticking of a clock could once again be felt. Though the laughter could still be heard, the smiles slowly melted away from the captain's and the first mate's faces. "He needs to know," Ben simply said, knowing that the red-haired man would understand his words. Shanks looked at the laughing boy a bit sadly as he answered, "I know." Ben studied the man for a minute before focusing on the life on the lower deck again. "Sooner is better than later. When we dock, he will want to come with you. If he doesn't know why he—" "I know," Shanks interrupted the taller man and added with a heavy sigh, "I'll tell him everything before we reach the island." For a moment, Ben felt like justifying the way he acted towards his captain, but quickly pushed the feeling away, knowing that it was exactly what he was supposed to do. He watched as Shanks pushed himself away from the railing, straightening himself and clearly preparing himself mentally. The man then walked to the stairs and called for Luffy. The boy's head instantly whipped around and focused on the man, resembling a log pose that had finally found the next island to head to. A smile spread onto the boy's face, oblivious to the strained one on Shanks' lips. He quickly got himself out of the grip of one of the crew members and ran towards the man, quickly forgetting about all the games he had been playing until then. "Shanks!" the boy exclaimed as he ran in front of the man, giggling as he received a ruffling of his hair. "Come here, Anchor, I have something to talk about," Shanks told and put a hand on Luffy's shoulder to guide him up the steps. Luffy's joy quickly turned into confusion as he could sense that something was a bit different from the usual Shanks. He quickly got a confirmation to his suspicion as Shanks took him somewhere away from everyone else and knelt in front of him, wearing a strange expression. "Luffy," Shanks started before taking a moment to search for the right words. "Do you know why you were with the Marines up until we met?" Luffy glanced away and looked thoughtful for a moment before shaking his head. Shanks nodded slowly and licked his lips before he could gather his courage to meet the child's confused gaze. "You see, your dad is someone who the Marines want to catch very badly," Shanks began and tried to think of a way to explain something like this to a 5-year-old. "My dad? Gramps said he is a bad man," Luffy said simply, clearly not having thought about his father much until then. "Yeah, the Marines would probably see him that way," Shanks stated more to himself than the child in front of him. He gave a light sigh before looking at Luffy meaningfully. "Luffy, the Marines will see your father as a threat as long as he lives, and that means that they will be after you as well," Shanks told and watched as fear mixed with the confusion on Luffy's face. "I want to keep you safe so that you won't ever have to go through those horrible things again. That's why you need to stay here on the ship, hidden, for now." "Shanks?" Luffy questioned, not keeping up with the conversation, but still understanding that there was something wrong. Shanks placed his hands on the boy's small shoulders. "The Marines don't know that you're here with us right now. If you stay here when we get to land, we have a better chance of keeping you safe. Can you do that, Luffy?" Luffy could sense that Shanks was going somewhere. He was going, and Luffy wasn't. "You're leaving?" Luffy asked sadly, his eyes wide with fear. Shanks glanced to his side before their eyes met again. "Yes, but I won't be gone for long, I promise." Luffy almost jumped in the air and started to shake his head wildly. "No, I don't want to," he told and flew against the man's chest, grasping a hold of his shirt. "Don't leave me." Shanks was a bit startled from Luffy's sudden outburst, but managed a smile and a pat on the boy's head. "It's okay, Luffy. Rue will stay here with you. You like Rue, don't you?" Luffy nodded against Shanks' chest, but didn't relax. "You two can play games all day," the red-haired pirate told while rubbing the small boy's back. "You won't even know I'm gone." Luffy's head whipped up. "I will. If Shanks isn't here, I'll be lonely." Shanks couldn't help but smile at Luffy's sincere words. "I know, Anchor. But I need your help on keeping the ship safe, okay?" "My help? Yeah. There are all sorts of criminals on land who might try to rob us. I'm going to need your help in keeping all our things safe. I can count on you, right?" Shanks told, hoping to rouse some feeling of excitement from Luffy. Luffy looked down sadly. "But I'm really tiny and weak. I can't do anything." Shanks smiled at the boy's words, already having prepared an answer. "That's not true, I told you. You aren't going to be alone. Rue will be here with you. So, if you see anything suspicious, you have to shout really loud so that Rue will hear. He can take care of anything up at Shanks with wide eyes. I just have to shout?" "That's right. I really need your help with this, so, can I trust you?" Shanks asked the boy seriously. Luffy seemed to think about it for a while. "When are you coming back?" he asked. Shanks gave a reassuring smile. "Soon. I will be back before sun goes down." Luffy's eyes lit up. "Really? Yes, really." A smile finally rose to the child's lips and he clenched his tiny fists in determination. He nodded. "I will protect Shanks' ship," he declared. Shanks ruffled Luffy's hair and stood up. "Thanks, Luffy. You're a big help." The two walked to the bow of the ship, Luffy staying right next to Shanks the entire time. However, the small, uncertain hand was gone from Shanks' pant leg this time. The two watched as the outline of the island was slowly coming to view, although this time the sight didn't seem as joyful as usual as it announced a short separation for the two. "No, Luffy, come on. You can't sit there all day." "No," the boy told once again stubbornly. Luffy had been sitting on the railing ever since the ship had docked and he had had to watch Shanks leave him behind. He had promised to protect the ship but Luffy decided that it was no fun without Shanks around. Rue sighed and scratched the back of his head thoughtfully. He was a bit lost on how to handle a child missing his parent. He knew he could never replace his captain, but wanted to do something for the kid. He looked around. The ship wasn't exactly child-friendly. The only toys they had were made of sharp metal or weighed about a ton, and were no way suitable things for a very uncoordinated, as they had been proven, child like Luffy to play with. He would have to be a bit more creative. Then he got it. "Hey, Luffy, you like adventures, right?" Rue prompted. Luffy's back straightened and his full attention was on the pirate. His eyes were wide and waiting as he made a sound of agreement. Rue smiled, he had finally got his attention. "Then, have you heard about the adventure where Shanks met giants?" Rue asked. Luffy's mouth opened wide and he shook his head wildly. "Shanks met giants?" he asked, all immersed in the story before it had even started. Rue smiled to himself. It had been a correct decision to use Shanks as the story's hero. This way, Luffy wouldn't miss the man as much during their separation. Yeah, this all happened on the first half of Grand Line. The sun had fallen low behind the horizon, coloring the sky in fiery hues of red. The only sound on the beach was the loud laughter of pirates who returned to their ship for the day. Their shoulders were weighted with supplies enough to feed an army, but none of them seemed to even notice the huge sacks or barrels as they laughed away. Once they were at their ship, the captain stopped. His first mate stood next to him and noticed the same thing as his captain had. "It's quiet." The joy was quickly gone from Shanks' features. Too quiet, he decided and threw down the barrel he had been carrying before quickly climbing up a rope to the deck. When he saw the empty ship, worry finally hit him with full force. The man didn't wait for backup but ran straight to the galley, which turned out to be empty as well. When he dashed across the deck towards his quarters, he was already shouting Luffy's name on top of his lungs. He didn't expect to find Rue sitting calmly in a chair, eating meat as usual, and hushing him once he stormed in. It took a moment before the now panicked man could understand what he was seeing. Once he did, he let out a breath he hadn't noticed he had been holding and leaned against the door frame. "I thought he had been taken," Shanks told quietly. "Captain, I wish you would trust me more than that," Rue told, but it was clear that he hadn't been offended. The small figure shifted and moved with a groan. Both of the men in the room turned their attention to the boy as he was woken from his sleep. Luffy slowly sat up on the bed. Rue?" the boy asked as he rubbed his eyes tiredly. But once he saw a glimpse of red hair at the door, the boy was wide awake. "Shanks." The man smiled. "Hey, Luffy. I'm back." Before Shanks could finish his sentence, a rubbery rocket collided with him. He was sent flying on the floor outside, his head colliding with the deck in a very uncomfortable way. However, the pain was quickly forgotten when he saw Luffy beaming at him. "Welcome back," Luffy said. "Rue told me to tell you that when you come here." Shanks didn't even notice the small error in Luffy's speech and just ruffled Luffy's head affectionately as he pushed himself up. "Thanks, Luffy. Did you protect the ship like I told you? Luffy nodded. Yeah, but Shanks, did you really fight a big sea king? Shanks was confused for a moment. I have fought many sea kings. No, Luffy shook his head and spread his arms. It was the size of an island. Shanks made a sound of understanding. Oh, that one. Yeah, it was a very tough opponent. Luffy's eyes turned into stars. That's so cool, Shanks is like a hero. Shanks laughed and patted Luffy's head. A hero? Pirates aren't heroes, Anchor. The man then looked over his shoulder. Hey, Ben, bring that thing, he told his first mate, who had long since boarded the ship and was helping with carrying the supplies. When he heard his captain, a smile spread on his face and he brought over a bag. Luffy looked confused when Shanks rummaged through the supply bag. Then, he found what he was looking for. He lifted something furry and brown. It turned out to be a big dog plush toy. Here, I brought you a present. A real dog might be a bit troublesome on the ship, but I'm sure this guy can at least protect you from your nightmares, Shanks explained proudly. Luffy looked at the plush toy for a while with his mouth wide open before his eyes started to sparkle. He reached for the toy and was surprised how soft the dog's fur was. Luffy just stared at the toy for a long time without letting out a single sound. Do you like it? Shanks had to ask. Luffy then quickly squeezed the toy against his chest and smiled more widely than Shanks remembered ever seeing. Yeah, the child told, his cheeks rosy from excitement and joy towards the gift. Youngsoul walked over to the three as his hands had finally gotten free of any cargo. He saw Luffy hugging the big dog while doing a small dance as the captain and first mate watched him. Ooh, Luffy, you got a doggy, huh? Youngsoul asked, stopping Luffy on his tracks. Have you named him yet? Luffy lifted the dog in front of his face and inspected it thoughtfully. I'll name him Shanks, 'cause he's the coolest. The said man gained a bit red on his cheeks at the cute and honest words of his protege. Yaa, as much as I appreciate that, Luffy, I think it might become a little confusing to have two Shanks on the ship. Luffy looked surprised at the man's words, clearly not being on the same page with the red-haired captain. You had a dog named Woof, didn't you? The captain questioned the boy. Luffy nodded and added, Admiral Woof. The three men smiled at the name. How about naming him Woof as well? You won't miss your old dog as much then, Shanks offered. Luffy looked at his new companion thoughtfully. Then, a smile spread on his face and he lifted the dog up. He's Captain Woof. Luffy felt angry. Or at least that's what he thought when his small mind couldn't place the feeling of frustration. They had been traveling for a long time now, how long exactly, Luffy couldn't remember, and he hadn't been allowed to come to land for the last 2 times they had docked. Now, he had once again been told to stay on the ship. Stupid Shanks, Luffy muttered and threw a toy car across the room in anger. The wooden toy made a loud sound in the silent room, but only he was around to hear it. He knew that someone had stayed behind to look after him, but Luffy didn't even know who it was this time. And if it was someone who didn't want to play with him, Luffy deduced that the person was probably not a fun person to be with tool like Shanks, unfortunately. Luffy looked up at the big pile of toys that had slowly accumulated next to his bed. The pirates would always bring him something from the towns they visited, just like Shanks had the first time he went away. Luffy looked at his companion that lay on the floor next to him. He grabbed the dog and hugged it to his chest tightly. None of the toys in front of him could ever replace anyone. The toys didn't speak to him or tell him jokes, nor did they give him hugs or a pat on the head when he wanted. Especially today, the toys felt really stupid. Luffy glared at the toys once more before standing up and heading to the door. He still held onto Captain Woof tightly as he walked to the dark deck. It wasn't nighttime yet, but the sky was full of thick clouds, making it seem like it was later in the day than it really was. Luffy wondered for a moment if it was going to rain, but the thought quickly vanished as he had learned not to try to read the weather in Grand Line. He walked to the railing and stared at the island they had docked at. The water had been deep enough for them to dock straight next to the land, unlike often when they had to take smaller boats to reach land. The island had a big mountain in the middle, and so Luffy could see the lights of the town built there. Shanks is probably there, Luffy said silently. He felt his mood worsen at the thought. He missed Shanks. Luffy wanted to get away from the ship badly. He wanted to go running around in a forest and taste yummy foods he had never heard of before. He wanted to be with Rue and Ben and Shanks and everyone, not be stuck on the ship all alone. Luffy didn't understand why, but he felt afraid. He wondered if Shanks left him on purpose and if he just thought that he was a bother. Luffy shook his head to get rid of those thoughts. Shanks wouldn't do that, he told himself. Luffy turned around and decided to find something to do. He marched to the galley and was determined to find the person in charge of him. He peeked into the room and saw one of the pirates sitting at a table, reading something. Or, at least that's what he had been doing before he had fallen asleep. Luffy frowned. He knew that the pirate wasn't going to be any fun. Then, an idea hit him. He almost dismissed it completely at first since it went against everything Shanks had told him not to do, but then his curiosity won over. Luffy ran back to the deck and looked at the island. A little walk couldn't hurt, right? There was no one around anyways. He would be back before anyone could notice. Luffy nodded to himself and quickly stuffed Captain Wolf inside of his red t-shirt that Usopp had picked for him. He then held onto the railing and started walking back to stretch his arms. There was no longer any pain, just the strange feeling of his arms stretching to an inhuman length. When he felt his body starting to move forward, he finally jumped up and let himself be rocketed from the ship. The flight was short, but made Luffy's heart race in a good way. He landed in an ungraceful way, rolling through the coastline for a moment before stopping. When his vision wasn't spinning anymore, Luffy jumped up and retrieved his friend from inside of his shirt. "We're going on an adventure, Captain Wolf. Are you ready?" Luffy asked the dog as he held it up. The toy didn't answer, but Luffy seemed happy enough even without receiving a single word. "Let's go!" Luffy shouted and pumped up his small fist in the air as he began to walk away from the ship. He didn't know quite how, but Luffy had at some point found himself wandering around the streets of an unfamiliar town. Unlike from far away, the town wasn't pretty up close. The streets were dirty, just like the people walking through them, and the air reeked of something Luffy hadn't smelled before. Luffy held onto his companion tightly and tried to avoid the eyes of the people around him. The sounds in the air consisted of shouts, laughter and strange screams. It was nothing like Luffy was used to and he decided that he didn't like it. He wondered for a moment if he should try calling out Shanks' name, but his throat felt too tight to let out a sound. The street was surprisingly long and Luffy started to feel hungry and scared. He turned around to see where he had come from, but found that he couldn't remember that anymore. Suddenly, two men were approaching Luffy, making him tense and whimper. They sneered at the sight of him and Luffy didn't like how their eyes looked. He squeezed his toy tighter against him and turned around to run, only to bump into someone and fall down. One of the men laughed. "Where did you come from, lil' kid? This isn't a good place for you to be in," one of the men behind Luffy told, his voice sounding too deep and terrifying for the boy. Luffy was unable to answer as he tried to scramble to his feet as fast as he could. He didn't know how, he just knew that he needed to get away from these men. "Not so fast," the fat man, whom Luffy had bumped into, told and grabbed Luffy's small arm. Luffy's skin stretched only for the smallest bit before he snapped back. He doubted the men had even noticed his powers. "How about you come with us? We need a bit more cash and kids sell high in these parts," one of the men, who was missing one of his eyes, Luffy now noticed, told. Luffy finally found his voice to protest. "No," the men only laughed at his defiance, and proceeded to pick him up and carry him away. Luffy watched as Captain Wolf dropped onto the dirty ground, all alone now that Luffy couldn't get to him. "No, stop!" Luffy kept shouting, hoping that someone would help him. However, though the street was filled with people, no one seemed to have any interest in what was happening to him. "Captain Wolf!" Luffy shouted right as the men were about to turn a corner. To his great surprise, he had just enough time to see someone dressed in white pick up his companion and run towards him. Then, the next few moments were a blur to him. One moment, he had been carried away by the really bad men, and the next, he was being held comfortably inside someone's arms as the men were all down on the ground. Luffy blinked a few times, partly expecting something more to happen. He then raised his head to look at the man who was currently holding him. First, he noticed the thick, black hair and the lazy eyes of the man, which slowly turned to look at him. "You all right there, kid?" the man asked. Luffy blinked a few times before managing a nod. The man then easily maneuvered Luffy onto the ground before he crouched in front of the boy. Even still, the man was unnaturally tall, and Luffy had to crane his neck back to see his face properly. "This thing," the man then spoke again, and showed Luffy's toy dog, "is yours, right?" Luffy quickly grabbed the dog and hugged it close with a wide smile. "Captain Wolf," he exclaimed, causing a tiny smile cross over the man's features. "It's dangerous here. Where did you come from?" the man then asked. "I ran away. From the ship," Luffy quickly stated without thinking. "Ran away?" The man wondered for a moment. "Where are your parents?" Luffy shook his head. "I don't have any." The man let out a sound that was something between a sigh and a groan. He held his head down for a moment before looking up again and asking the kid, "What's your name?" "Luffy." "Okay, Luffy. My name is Kuzan. I'm a marine. I'll take you to the base so we can find." "A marine?" Luffy cut the man off. His small face was quickly twisted in more fear than he had showed when he had been kidnapped. "Yeah, you don't have to be scared, I'm one of the good guys," the man tried to explain. "No," Luffy then shouted and prepared himself. "I'm not gonna go with someone like you." The man raised his hands in defense. Oi, don't get angry with me. I'm just trying to help you out. The same thing will happen if I let you go by yourself. Here, just come with me," the man told and offered his hand. Luffy, unsurprisingly, didn't agree with the man's plan, and was about to turn around and suddenly disappeared from underneath him. It only took him a few moments for him to realize that he was, once again, being taken against his will. "No, you stupid marine," Luffy shouted. "Let me go." The man let out a long sigh and strode ahead. "I wish I could, but my conscience won't let me sleep if I do. Just bear with me. I'm not going to hurt you." Although the man spoke in a calm manner, Luffy was not at all convinced of his words. He kept struggling against the tight grip that held him against the man's shoulder without avail. "I don't want to. Not again," Luffy shouted. "Help me, Shanks."